Hello, everybody, and welcome to the ISO2400.org webinar on modern slavery. I'm Shaun McCarthy. I'm the Director of Action Sustainability Community Interest Company that sponsors this initiative. I'm sponsoring this initiative because I was part of the delegation developing the ISO 2400 standard, and that delegation at the end of a 4-year process in developing the standard actually decided that they really wanted to do more to spread the word about sustainable procurement and to share knowledge. So we set up a website, we've set up a self-assessment tool that people can use, and we've got people from over 150 different countries participating in our social media initiatives, viewing our website, using our resources, etc. So without further ado, we'll make a start. Today's subject is modern slavery, and this is a subject that's of great concern around the world. We have Robin from Australia, Chris from the UK, but with a supply chain in India and in Vietnam and various other parts of the world. Valentina, based in Italy, but with a very international perspective. And then finally, Helen from the UK. Robin, over to you.
Thank you, Shaun. I'll start by acknowledging the Bidjigal and Gadigal people who traditionally lived along the Sydney coastline, where I am now. Pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and also those, I noticed a number of participants from Australia, so pay my respects to elders in the lands wherever you're joining us from. My name's Robin Mellon. I'm, for want of a better term, a sustainability educator, but I've been working a lot in the both environmental and social sides over the last couple of decades. When it comes to human rights issues in Australia and the Modern Slavery Act 2018, I'm going to split my comments into past, present and future and say a few words on each. Looking at the past, there's been a lot of work going on over the last decade, especially since the UK Act came in 2015, and the momentum really built sort of 2015 to 2017 with increasing government consultation across all sectors, and some really great exploratory documents, including the 2017 Hidden in Plain Sight report, which is on the Australian government website. Then in 2018, the Modern Slavery Act was enacted by the Australian government with a threshold of 100 million Australian dollars, so around 50 million Great British pounds. The Act also requires the Australian government to publish an annual modern slavery statement covering its own procurement and investment activities. But state and territory governments, as well as local governments, councils across Australia, are not required to report, although they can do so voluntarily. And then last year, 2019, the guidelines for reporting entities were released, detailing the 7 criteria that each reporting entity needs to use to explain how they're assessing and addressing the risks of modern slavery in both their operations and their supply chains. Now, reporting entities, those larger organizations, must submit a public statement by 31st of December this year or 31st of March next year. So that depends on their financial reporting cycle. It's not often that I say that there's a really great government document, but the guidelines for reporting entities really are very clear, very informative, and I'm not just saying that because I helped write them, but because they really do set out the expectations there. And at the same time, over the last few years, a New South Wales Modern Slavery Act has been developed for this state with a lower threshold, a threshold of 50 million Australian dollars, so about 25 to 30 million Great British pounds, and with also penalties for non-compliance. But it's not yet been enacted by New South Wales government and seemingly is on hold during the COVID-19 pandemic. So if we turn to the present, I guess there are really 4 main groups emerging. The first are the leaders who are single organizations. And those are often international organizations with international requirements. Perhaps they're already reporting in other jurisdictions like the UK. And many of those are banks, the large banks, or the telcos, telecommunication companies. But there's also trailblazers, people like Fair Trade, looking at tea, coffee, chocolate, or Outland Denim, they're in fashion, who've gone out of their way to establish and maintain ethical supply chains. And so they've got these leaders have existing policies and procedures and grievance mechanisms. The next group is really the leaders who are taking collective action. And that is often within particular sectors, such as property and construction or telecommunications. And there are some great initiatives. The Supply Chain Sustainability School is going really well here in Australia now, as well as the Property Council of Australia's Modern Slavery Supplier Platform, which has been developed to collect supplier assessment information from across the sector for free. So it's a free function for suppliers. And it provides them links with capacity building, with resources, with case studies, whilst allowing the platform partners to assess and address particular labor and materials risks. So it's a bit like SEDEX, but it's free and it's educational for suppliers. The third group is, I guess, the mid-range. These are the organizations waking up to the fact that they're either reporting entities or their major clients are. They're now working frantically to complete reporting and policies and processes and procedures and connections. And they're looking to access the resources that already exist across different platforms, like the Supply Chain Sustainability School, and different media as well. And then the fourth group, unsurprisingly, is the rest. These are the organizations who are literally just waking up to the issue and looking around and realizing that they are probably under-resourced and trying to work out how and what to prioritize, given that the main thrust of the Modern Slavery Act 2018 is continuous improvement. And then finally, I'll turn to the future part. I've probably got 6 key observations about the next 12 months or so. The first is that many organizations are at last using the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN SDGs, and ISO 2400 to frame this human rights and modern slavery work. So it's really good to see these elements being drawn together and the environmental, the economic, the social issues being aligned around procurement and leverage. The second observation is that a lot of work is still really siloed within sectors. So property looks at property, food and beverage looks at food and beverage. So there's a definite need to look around between industries to try and increase that collaboration. I know that's a constant cry, but increase collaboration, but increase sharing of information and case studies so that we can focus on the risk of harm to people, not intellectual property. The third observation is that there's a lot of people realizing that their human rights policies may not actually mean anything, or at least they need tightening up if they have one at all. So I think we can expect a flurry of work around what these mean and how they connect to other documents and initiatives. Fourth observation, we're going to see an increasing focus on so what do we do when we find it question and the role of grievance mechanisms. Many organizations have or share a whistleblower hotline, but it may only be internal. So there's a lot of work needed around how the voice of the worker can be heard or heard better. Fifth, and a really big topic, there's going to be a lot more work undertaken around the 8 key elements of remediation. Remediation is going to be increasingly important. As although many of those 8 key elements are done really well in Australia and across the Asia Pacific, they're often looked after by very different agencies or organizations or civil society. And the last observation, I guess, to round this off is about joining the dots. As I've said, many organizations have great policies and processes and procedures and codes of conduct or initiatives, but they're going to need to join those together to make sure they relate, they connect. And that's going to take a lot more collaboration, both internally and externally, so that all the teams, HR and procurement and projects and finance and risk and compliance and CDA leadership can not just prioritize actions for the next few years, according to the risk of harm to people, but actually achieve business coherence. That's it from me. I will pass the baton on to the next person, but look forward to the discussion.
Okay, Helen.
Thank you. My name is Helen Carter. My background is procurement, has been since I left university a very long time ago. And over the last sort of 13 years, focused specifically on sustainable procurement, how you use supply chains and embed requirements into your supply chain. Probably around about sort of 6 years ago now, I was given this small little task in the supply chain school to look at what the impact of the Modern Slavery Act would be in the UK, particularly in construction, because that's where the supply chain school lives. And it was a really good example back then of where collaboration works very well. So we worked with a lot of principal contractors, we worked with a lot of interested stakeholders to try and provide information to the supply chain on how to comply with this act. Now, the act I would probably describe as the sort of parent to the Australian Act. So there are bits in the act that are very similar to the elements that Robin has described. You have to do the statement, it's got a threshold of around 36 million associated with it. And there were guidelines, which actually aren't that bad, that our government created, giving advice to organisations on how to comply. The one bit that we are probably weaker than the Australian is that it doesn't really have any teeth. And I know Chris will probably show you exactly how lack of teeth it has got, how much lack of teeth it has got with the current compliance of the Act. But it was a very straightforward Act to comply with. You basically had to be £36 million as the turnover. You basically had to say what you were doing to identify and combat slavery. You had to have it signed by directors. You had to publish it. It had to be endorsed at board level. So it's not a complex thing to comply with, but it has been relatively poor. Like Robin, I'd say the evolution in the UK has not been dissimilar. We have had really streamed away and have done best practice within this area. And within the school, Supply Chain Sustainability School, we produced a wealth of materials that organisations get access to that allow them to understand how to comply with the Act, how to actually put the due diligence processes in place. And I myself, probably since 2016, have trained over about 3,000 people in understanding what modern slavery is and how to select it, how to identify it. I would say if we were to look at the Modern Slavery Act today in the UK, we've obviously had a similar thing as the rest of the world. COVID's come in, which has actually led to the delay in the update of the legislation. So once the Australian legislation went out, the UK government did actually say maybe we should look at the Act, maybe we should think about putting a little bit of teeth in. The recommendation was to almost replicate what Australia had done with penalties and fines for lack of compliance. But funnily enough, that hasn't been picked up as quickly as a lot of stakeholders would like, and the government's sort of nervous about doing that. And that decision is sort of on hold until obviously we can combat the current crisis we're in with COVID. If I was to talk about how modern slavery is perceived in the UK, and it'll be interesting later to talk to Robin about the media perception, there's definitely an increase in media upstanding within the UK. There's a lot more stories about exploitation happening. And when the Act first came out in 2015, it was predicted that we had around about 13,000 victims in the UK. The latest figure is around about 136,000. People believe it could be slightly higher, some believe it could be a little bit lower, but we are finding more and more every month, every week. And if you work with organisations like the Gang Masters Labour Abuse Authority, you will see them constantly looking at organisations and understanding what's going on within this hidden crime. So there's a lot more in the UK than you think. And I think that's been the biggest problem we've had with traction in trying to get the Act adopted across the UK within businesses. I've run a couple of sessions with boards, really making them aware of what the issue is around modern slavery, and it's not been surprising that they are totally unaware. So it's been kind of hard getting traction with boards to get them to take this issue seriously, both at a UK level in terms of what's going on within organisations, but actually the biggest challenge, particularly in the industry that I operate in construction, is that transparency in supply chains. How do we actually understand what's going on within the supply chain at an international level? I'll give you an example. Out of the 45 million victims there are across the globe, 18% of that can be attributed to the construction industry. So the majority of that is in the products that we purchase in our industry. The majority of it is not the workers on our sites, but actually the products in our slate, in our concrete, and Chris will give you some really good examples of what Marshalls are doing within that space. So it's been really hard to get businesses to sort of think about that longer transparency piece. I think in terms of where the UK is starting to go, though, we are starting to have more conversations around transparency now. Admittedly, not brought on probably by modern slavery, but more about the current COVID crisis. So the current COVID crisis is forcing organisations to think more about how they work better with their supply chains, to understand how they can get resilient supply chains going forward. And what that's doing is allowing us an opportunity to think about how we overlay resilience with issues around modern slavery and in fact other sustainability issues, whether it happens with carbon or water shortages or the waste agenda. So there is almost like this a moment where organisations are realising that they need to be a bit more informed. I think the other thing that's starting to help in the UK is the conversation is starting to move away from just modern slavery. So there's been a lot of work done over the last few years on the spectrum of labour standards. So actually in the UK, we're starting to have a much more intelligent conversation around how do we treat people? That if we have bad EDI practices, if we have bad skills and training, if we have bad payments, no minimum wage, those sorts of issues, slavery actually can quite happily fit within that profile as a most extreme area of abuse. And in fact, it's a really interesting, the case in the UK at the moment, some of you may or may not be aware of, is the one around the Boohoo, so the clothing organisation. The COVID crisis led everybody to start looking at what they were doing. Everyone cried modern slavery, but actually as we've been in there, it's just very bad labour practices. There's no slavery, but there are very poor labour practices with bad PPE, bad health and safety, bad payments. So it shows the conversation starts to get a bit more tangled and intelligent. What that does allow us to do then, I think, in the UK is start to have a conversation at board level about the general people issue. And one of the things we've had some success within the school is the launch of our People Matter Charter, which is designed specifically to do this. So the charter we created in the supply chain school is designed for wherever you sit in the supply chain. If you have people, you treat them fairly, you treat them well, you train them, you make sure you've got good EDI, you make sure you have due diligence around modern slavery. So that's starting to bring the conversation a little bit more into a business environment that's now tying in a lot with things like the ESGs, which is really, really important, I think, going forward. I think the final bit for me is sort of like echoing Robin's point. 6 years on, grievance remediation is still not known. I'm still doing a lot of training on just at least spotting the signs, and I'm still having conversations today to organisations who say, if I find it, what do I do? So a shout out in the UK to anybody who's UK based, you should be having links with the GLAA, the Gangmasters Licensing Authority. You should be thinking about the Modern Slavery Helpline. There are so many organisations out there that can help with that, so focus on that piece. And also, just to let you know, in the UK, we are currently in the process of writing a BSI standard for this, on the due diligence that we have within organisations, of which I'm particularly interested in, and I'm currently helping draft the procurement element associated with that. So what do we do within supply chains? And as a procurement professional, I sort of call out to any procurement people in the room, this is the perfect opportunity for us to start thinking about how we drive value through what we procure and really sort of embrace that transparency piece going forward. So we are better now than we've used to be. We still haven't got enough of those organisations that have this as business as usual. There is a lot more support out there than you realise. But it is still a continuous conversation going on. And all I will say is that from a UK perspective, the reputational issue is becoming more and more prominent. So the Boohoo, I've seen in the questions to Antonio, yes, the gloves with the PPE, we are now starting to see more and more pressure from a media perspective. So organisations do need to start taking this a lot more seriously because it's starting to affect share prices.
Wonderful. Thank you, Helen. So we'll hand over to Valentina now if we can.
All right. Thank you so much, Shaun. So I'm Valentina Gurney. I'm the Senior Manager of Business Assurance at DNVGL. We're focusing on audits, basically assuring property and supply chains of the companies that we work with. My journey to this role has been complicated and interesting at the same time because I have previously worked for certification bodies for international organizations and also for advocacy, shareholder advocacy group, basically where I was developing policies that are based on field investigations across multiple supply chains. So I worked both in tandem with global companies with supply chains and also conducted independent investigations in some of the most dangerous industries or industries that are mostly hit with modern slavery, hidden modern slavery. So in that capacity, of course, I can speak not just on the hidden dangers of modern slavery and the definitions, but also some of the best practices and what can companies do to protect themselves, and what are some of the things and solutions that have worked. So first of all, to just echo Robin and Helen's point about the hidden dangers of modern slavery, I wanted to bring and highlight one point that keeps recurring right now. So whenever we talk about modern slavery, we talk about, of course, reputational risk and people at the center. And as supply chains have changed in the past 30 to 40 years, and they have moved around the world for various benefits to the companies, we are looking at the greater mobility of people. And one of the most vulnerable right now segments of workers are the migrant workers in global supply chains. And this is true for a number of reasons. First of all, now many industries like agriculture employ seasonal workers. These workers are usually not protected by the local legislation. They're on temporary visas and they're much more vulnerable to any kind of abuse, to unpayment of wages, and just general lack of protection. Then if we look at other sectors like electronic, automotive sectors, very labor-intensive sectors like apparel, footwear, of course, construction, we are looking at people moving also either on short-term or even longer-term, up to 3-year contracts to, again, seasonal work. And now that mobility is focused across the continent sometimes. Sometimes they have to take a plane. There are additional fees that are involved in that process. And by the nature of this type of employment, we are looking at workers that are essentially in debt before they even start their work journey, before they even receive any wages. So debt is really a focal point here, and modern slavery originates from that point of debt, where the fees, the recruitment fees, are sometimes so high that a worker has to work without a salary, essentially, or they work to repay the debt for up to even a year. So in these kind of situations, it's important for multinational firms and firms that employ that kind of labor first to understand where those dangers are and also how to remediate them, of course. And these kind of dangers also call for a bespoke type of business assurance, or different types of auditing that we have not seen implemented in the field before. They call for greater engagement of the workers, as Helen mentioned, greater room for and greater need for worker voice and better grievance channels to understand, first of all, how we can help them, where the dangers are, and how we can complete the cycle of assurance with remediation. How can we really be sure that the policies have been implemented if they are in a company, and the workers have been remediated at the end? So some of the best practices here, if we look just at the issue of migration, mobility, and exploitation of migrant labor, and also I wanted to give you a little bit of a a number. So currently in the world, there are about 40 million people that are in the conditions of modern slavery, and that's included first marriage, but 25 million of them are employed in the private sector. And this is a conservative number. Of course, we cannot calculate all of the instances and all of the instances of informal employment, but it's a very high number. Also considering that 1 in every 7 people is a migrant, we're also looking at a number of 250 million that are international migrants, and 760 million, those are the internal migrant workers. This is basically, if we look at countries where internal migration is very central, like India, Bangladesh, where people move across the regions, and they're not less vulnerable because of it. So what are some of the best practices to combat this danger? Well, first of all, policy again. I know that we have mentioned that many policies do have weaknesses. However, in my work with companies, we've noticed that not every company that might be subjected to these dangers has even a proactive policy that targets these kind of dangers that are emerging, that are kind of new, that we didn't know before. So it's very important to have a policy that states what the company is going to do vis-a-vis, for example, recruitment fees and reimbursement of those fees. What is the company's stance on hiring that labor, migrant labor, for example? So starting with the policy and looking at the current legislations from the California Transparency Act to Australian Modern Slavery Act, of course, UK Modern Slavery Act, many others like France's Loi de Vigilance and others. Of course, there is a need to protect the rights of these people. But some of the measures are not exactly prescriptive. In that sense, we also have to look at some of the national legislation, for example, in countries like Thailand, where the risks of violations in labor supply chains, especially for migrant labor, are very high. And the seafood industry, for example, has been hit hard with many reputational risks when it comes to the hiring of migrant labor. There, the government has responded robustly with many different policies that prohibit the charging of recruitment fees. These are changes that can happen continuously, and the companies that have operations in countries like these have to really monitor what are these changes, whether or not they're even in compliance with the local law that is changing fast. Proactive policy that takes into consideration international norms as well as the local norms that might be changing is very important. Another best practice would be to reduce the number of middlemen that are involved in the hiring of migrant labor. In Asia, for example, this practice is normal. It's something that is a part of many cultures to have a recruiter to direct labor to where labor is needed. However, that is a process that involves another party, and these are the parties that are frequently charging the workers these fees. It's important to understand whether or not the agent or the broker has been licensed, if they're operating even legally in the context of recruitment, and then second of all, to establish a relationship with that broker or brokers. That actually also changes dramatically the paradigm of business assurance and how audit is perceived, because previously we didn't really know about it. We didn't know about that hidden danger. That segment, recruiters, for example, has never been included in the scope of a traditional audit until, I believe, 2016, when some of the leading certification schemes have introduced the concept of migrant labor and recruiters and added them to the scope of the certification. So it is important to understand how people are recruited, when, if we can even remove that segment altogether by direct recruitment, may not be possible for all the companies, only maybe for large companies. And then, of course, include that segment segment in the scope of certification and scope of an audit, interview them, make sure that the information is present, it's corroborated, triangulated, etc. And then, of course, besides focusing on the policy and direct recruitment, we need to understand what are the suppliers' perspective on the same subject. So I think, in the age of internet and the age of greater visibility and heightened reputational risk, the answer is always greater engagement, greater understanding who you're dealing with, who you're working with, who your suppliers are. I think we're past the point where the business could have been done in supply chains around the world without really knowing who is there, how the process is conducted, how it's supervised, whether or not it's clean, whether or not it's safe from the reputational perspective, who are the people that are working for you. All of these things are really coming to light, coming to surface. And that calls for greater responsibility on the part of companies to really engage, understand, monitor, and really be more involved. That also presents many challenges for auditors and different approaches to auditing. I would say that in the current climate, we're looking for more bespoke solutions, for more solutions that call for innovative use of technology, for continuous monitoring, for remote audits, or things where we have to do a much deeper, greater investigation before we go in the field. And of course, to Helen's point, greater engagement with the workers themselves. That can be done through a variety of hotlines, through a variety of different platforms. We know that migrant workers in some areas, like for example, for the biggest migration channel between US and Mexico, there are many different platforms that use Facebook to engage with more of workers. It's just one of the solutions, but there are many, many others. So all of that really factors on the way we see the reality now. We collect information, and we have to really refer to those sources because they can be very valuable. That can give us an understanding of who the bad players are, where can we have, or where can we go, and where we can focus our efforts, and for the companies to also assess their risks in that way. The same goes for third-party verifiers, like my company, second-party auditors that need to include these methods, additional methods, in the way we conduct investigations. Having said all that, I also would like to mention that compliance doesn't often mean that we have ethical practices in the supply chain. With the current status of the way compliance world is operating, there are some emerging dangers, there are some hidden dangers that are not yet included. And for example, being compliant in the recruitment world doesn't mean recruiting workers ethically. So that really calls for a greater responsibility for all stakeholders to really look beyond compliance. What does it mean for us to be ethical? In a general sense, in a holistic sense, also looking at other risks, because whenever there is a poor practice or where people are vulnerable and being abused, you can bet that there are other risks in those supply chains, also environmental risks, also operational risks, and all of that can really pose a great danger for a company, cause for a divestment. Shareholders might stop investing in your company, but beyond that, you can lose consumer confidence and overall really cause a disaster in the times when many companies are already so vulnerable to the current pandemic crisis. Beyond compliance is really something that I wanted to highlight, and that also involves working with various industry initiatives, collaborating between the companies, really understanding what the risks are and combating those problems together, because frequently companies work with the same suppliers, and to exert the leverage on the supplier to change practices is a really slow and difficult process. It really calls for a united voice of many of clients to really create that change. And the change is always difficult and it's gradual. So it starts with understanding and collecting and investigating the risks, understanding where they are, and then for a greater effort on remediation from all involved, all the stakeholders.
Brilliant. Thank you, Valentina. Chris, you, I know, have a lot of experience in this space around the whole question of supply chain engagement and certification, etc. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. So my name is Chris Harrop. I'm the Sustainability Director for Marshalls PLC, listed construction building materials company in the UK. About 86-87% of what we supply is manufactured in the UK from UK raw materials, with a large UK footprint and supply chain. But we do import materials, namely, most importantly, natural stone from around the world: India, China, Vietnam, Brazil, to a lesser extent, places like Portugal and Turkey. That raises all sorts of questions around supply chain sustainability, not just practically, but from an environmental and from an ethical perspective. I suppose one of the ways to think about this is from a holistic sustainability perspective. Now, Marshalls, we joined or became signatories of the UN Global Compact back in 2009, mainly because of the holistic view that it takes of human rights, labour rights, environment, and governance. And we've started to embed those issue areas and principles into the way that we think about the business. And a lot of that is around transparency of supply chains and making sure that that transparency is back along the supply chain, back to the raw material, but then all the way through the customer as well, in terms of its delivery, installation, the labour, the workforce used in that, and then ultimately its use in field, right the way through to its disposal, if we're talking about things like environment, carbon footprinting, water footprinting, etc., circular economy. Alongside the work that we do with the UN Global Compact, and actually I ended up chairing the UN Global Compact in the UK for 4 years back in the early 2010s. I'm a director of the Ethical Trading Initiative, so with the ETI base code covering all of the various aspects and really challenging businesses to understand their international supply chains. We became very aware of issues of modern slavery, child labour, debt bonded, I think was mentioned before, debt bonded labour back in around 2005-06, especially around India, and have been very active on the ground in India in mapping and clarifying and simplifying and assuring and putting our arms around the Indian supply chain with a very, very good partner in India. Obviously challenges in other countries. The sad reality for construction and certainly for building materials and probably our products as well, landscaping, paving, and building materials, is that we are, unfortunately, the bad boy globally around forced labour. And some of the numbers were mentioned before, but around the world, construction is the biggest sector or the biggest user of forced labour. So it's 4.5 million people is the current estimate around the world. Now, I actually think that is a gross underestimation, and certainly the issues around migrant labour and immigration, as was mentioned before. So I think that's on the light side. Certainly from a UK perspective, the numbers were very small in the early days. The government were talking around, maybe it's 10,000, 12,000, maybe at a stretch somebody would go a little bit further than that. But I think generally now people are thinking UK is about 136,000 on the last numbers. I think Helen mentioned that before. We're due for an update, and again, I think that number will go up. And one of the reasons I know that, and I'll talk a little bit about what Marshalls do later, is that we make nigh on 300,000 deliveries of building materials every year, and through the kind of strategies and the find and fix and the workforce and colleague engagement and training we've done, we've been able to highlight and report a lot of instances and has clearly provided lots of data. So the numbers around the world for construction are truly shocking, and it is around labour, whether it's direct labour on a site, and there's still lots of instances of that. Even in the UK, there's a police investigation called Operation Fort, if anybody would like to Google that, which was quite shocking in terms of some of the very high profile contractors, some of the international contractors that had issues on sites. But around the world, then, it is about about building the source and the supply chain, and building resilience in the supply chain is a key challenge. Now, when I think about actors in the sector, and quite right, we have our Modern Slavery Act in the UK, 2015. I did a check this morning on the most up-to-date numbers for building products, and actually in the UK, where it's been in 5 years now, only 21% of companies are meeting the minimum requirements of the Modern Slavery Act in building materials. And the minimum requirements are that there is a statement, it's on the homepage of the company's website, it's signed by a director, and it's approved by a board. Now that to me is not a very high bar to meet. And that's before we start to talk about transparency in supply chains, human rights, due diligence, mediation, finding, linking to UN guiding principles, protect, respect, remedy, process for remedies, etc. So construction, we have a lot to do. And construction companies, I would categorize in 3 ways. I think there are corporate perpetrators, and we've seen around the world and in the UK, businesses who knowingly employ modern slaves. There are businesses who I'd typify as corporate witnesses. So they are businesses who are big enough to know, but choose to turn a blind eye with almost, when I'm caught, I'll do something about it strategy. There are those in the UK, and there certainly are those internationally in various supply chains, and we come across them, and we run a mile from them when we see them. And then ultimately, sadly, there are corporate victims, and victims a difficult world, because clearly the victims of modern slavery are the real victims, but businesses who legally go about their business and are victims of principally organized crime, and are unwittingly using modern slavery. So they're the kind of the ways to kind of think of businesses, and quite rightly, I'd encourage everybody in the call to make sure that you aren't a victim, and that you have the policies and processes in place. And it does start with policies, as quite rightly said, but actually it is about processes. And right back in sort of pre-Modern Slavery Act, we implemented a strategy at Marshalls called Find and Fix. It's about making sure that every single person in our organization is aware of the signs of modern slavery. Everybody's had access to training. Everybody has a little card. There are little wallet cards that everybody gets to carry with the signs of modern slavery, all the telephone numbers, police numbers if it's an immediate risk, modern slavery helplines, the numbers of all the people within our organization, that they're aware of what it looks like, and then what to do. And then from an international supply chain perspective, it's about developing deep relationships with a number of trusted suppliers and tracing back all the way through to where the raw materials have come from and looking at that process. So in places like China, where it's even more difficult, we have our own office of quality and ethical control. So they're there in the factories and the quarries every day to work out and to make sure that the standards that we have are in place. And this is about accepting. Anybody in the call who doesn't believe there is modern slavery in their supply chain is either a corporate perpetrator or is delusional. So we've got to accept it exists, and then we've got to put in place this find and fix approach. The simplest thing is within a direct control of a supply chain. So the direct labor, the labor providers, the conditions on site. And modern slavery is just probably one of a number of abuses that we'll find. And Helen mentioned Boohoo, the fashion company in the UK. Bad businesses are bad businesses, full stop. But it's about then choosing the right partners. So whether it's internationally with the right, and for us, the right NGOs, the right social investigators, and I don't call them auditors, they're investigators who go and really understand what's going on and link us through to the right people to start to fix things. And then in the UK, it's organisations to help us understand and track. And then when modern slavery is found, to help those individuals recover. So personally, I'm involved in an immigration advice unit as a trustee to help those people who have immigration issues and have been trafficked or been exploited. And then I'm also involved as a trustee of an organisation that then puts a rescued slave into good employment. So, generally, and we've certainly seen it through COVID, I think the immigration advice unit was saying something like 20% of the immigrants on the books at the moment for that unit have skills that are in demand by our health services. So a lot of the migrants and the forced labourers have skills. They just need to be looked after properly, treated fairly, and given a fair opportunity if they have the right skills. So this is about finding, fixing, and taking responsibility. It's not about throwing money at it. It's not about ticking boxes on audits. It's about making sure that everybody understands the requirements, the moral imperative, as well as the business imperative from a reputational perspective, and then feeling empowered to make the phone call when they see something.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks to all our speakers. I think we could probably go on all day with questions and conversations. So thanks to those of you that have posted questions. The first one came in very early from Antonio, specifically, I think, for Helen, but open to any of the panel. Do we know of any other examples? There was a very heavily publicised example in the UK about PPE for the healthcare sector in Malaysia. Do we know of any other examples? Now, interestingly, we ran a webinar about a month or so ago on healthcare procurement, and certainly my take would be nobody was looking. They just wanted to get the stuff, and sort of due diligence and checks and balances, I think, went out of the window. But Helen, have you anything to add to that?
In the UK, yeah, there's actually been quite a few cases found. Obviously, my bent is looking a lot at what's going on in construction, and what we're finding in construction particularly are cases further down the supply chain. So there have been 3 or 4 instances I know of where building sites have been infiltrated by criminal gangs, and victims have been released. And it's kind of interesting, this whole idea of organised crime. So one of the things that we talk about a lot when we talk to law enforcement and people like the Gangmasters Labour Abuse Authority is the perception people have that this is a massive sort of mafia network of individuals who are moving people all over the place. And in some instances it is, but actually one of the things that we have to think about from an organisational perspective is actually those small silos of organised crime that are perpetrating their way into organisations. So what we're finding in the UK, where we're finding cases of them, is it's not necessarily massive trafficking issues. It might be some opportunists who've got a small network where they can move people around under the radar, 3 or 4 people, and they can put feelers out to bring people in, and it's even harder to detect because of the numbers that they're moving within organisations. So I know of at least 10 or 11 different instances so far within the construction industry over the last 3 or 4 years. Very prolific within the industry entities. I think we think at the moment the highest risk areas are waste, potentially demolition, areas like the products obviously internationally that we're looking for. So the PPE has been quite high profile in the UK. The biggest case that I show anybody, if you do have access to UK TV, there is a Horizons called Horizons expose called The Hunt for Hidden Slaves. I can't remember, Chris, if that was Operation Fort, but there was one where they reckon there might be 400 victims that they've located in the UK from Poland that have been brought in from vulnerable areas in Europe, and they've been found working in supply chains with very good due diligence. So again, be careful. Due diligence might be in place. You might be doing something, but there may be somebody who's infiltrated your organisation, in this case, who's able to be the only Polish speaker, therefore able to influence the decisions that's being made. So even with the best due diligence, you still need to be aware, because we are literally seeing them weekly, monthly in the UK in terms of the number of cases that we're finding.
Yeah, it was Operation Fort, and a lot of Romanian
Yes.
organised gangster crime as well.
Yeah.
And I think that just shows, it was some very well-known contractors who would be perceived to be trying to do the right thing, but it was a compliance approach rather than an acceptance that they would be targeted. And I think back to the question around the PPE, I think just think about this: you're potentially, like cybercrime, you are being attacked by criminals who are looking to exploit weak areas.
Yes.
And when push comes to the shove, like the pandemic, people are desperate to get hold of PPE, and therefore corners could be cut just to get some. So it is, as a good way, we do talk about this within Marshalls, it's the same way that the corporate networks are trying to be, or are being attacked through cybercrime. Our supply chains and our labour is being attacked by criminals seeking to exploit.
And to add to Chris's point, one of the things we haven't really mentioned in this so far is that we've talked a lot about corporate responsibility, corporate policy, corporate due diligence systems. But one of the things I've had the greatest success with so far in the construction industry is educating people on the front line. That it's a responsibility to identify slavery. It's not, and I've had conversations with people saying, what's the, how do I elevate this to the hierarchy? Who makes the ultimate decision? The reality is, to combat slavery, it's everybody's role. If you find it, what do you do? So when you're thinking about how you educate your organisation, yes, you need to educate the board so that they look at it properly. Yes, you need to have education, procurement, all those guys. But actually, if you have people at the front end in your warehouses, with the cleaners, whoever they are, who speak to these people on an individual level, they are your eyes and ears. They are the people that can then actually help you find it. And they need to be educated to understand what to do.
Yeah, we've got some information online around our program of Power of Logistics, and that's to that point. So our logistics drivers are empowered to and trained and aware to spot the signs, and then they know what to do. Really quite straightforward. They're not investigators, they don't get involved, but when you see something that's not quite right, it doesn't look right, probably isn't, report it.
Brilliant, thank you both. I've got 3 questions with kind of quite an international flavour, probably then for Valentina to lead off. The first one, how best can we curb the immigration slavery where people, especially Africans, are enticed with nice job offers in the Middle East, only to find that they end up as slaves, including being advertised on sale in an online auction? We've also got a question here. What is your opinion about technology development in migration of slave labour risk, as already happening in environmental risks like deforestation? And Valentina, you touched on the subject of technology. And then there's another question here, which I hope you can kind of wrap into into one summary. Regarding culture and beyond compliance, in today's environment for culture, have highlighted sensitivity to identity and nationality and seeking unscrupulous recruiters taking advantage of political correctness to shield their practices. How can auditors overcome this hurdle? And I think, Chris and Valentina, you've kind of covered that a little bit in terms of the role of audit. So there's something about the sort of international trafficking industry, and Chris and Helen have already alluded to the fact that this is about organised crime. This is not just about some slightly unscrupulous employers. This is big criminal acts. How can technology help? And then what's the role of audit and all of that? Sorry, that's quite a big question.
It's a big question. There are many layers to the question. And let me just maybe, open it up a little bit. So first of all, in terms of auditing hurdle and identifying the risks, of course, this is a kind of a two-prong where we can use technology to our advantage, and also how we can better prepare to identify the risks, because it really all comes from knowledge. The more you know, the more you know. So for auditors to combat and investigate cases of trafficking and forced labor, first of all, they have to be very well aware of the realities on the ground. They have to come prepared. They now, in the age of digital technology and having many resources available to them online, there are many platforms that are calculating the risks of corruption, where modern slavery is even happening, some of the salient hot pressure points. We also have a lot more information now on the types of industries and the type of labor that can be more subjected to violations. So all of that becomes a part of the preparation of an auditor and for a better, more in-depth investigation. Of course, to the question on auditing hurdles also, hiring more native speakers, absolutely. Native language is a critical part of that, and it becomes a vital part of a capacity of an audit team to understand and to be able to communicate directly with any party that they're investigating. Of course, it is very, very critical. So with technology, remote in particular, remote audits, that gives us really a possibility to extend our reach to a greater pool of expertise. Basically gives us a little bit of that time cushion to investigate better, to investigate deeper, and also to utilize the kind of experts that would not be otherwise available either in the field immediately, but potentially technically are there. So with that, we can prepare for an audit better, and if we need to, and if for most social audits, we must supplement it with a field face-to-face visit. We can just use technology to be better prepared and have a better investigation and have all of the documents verified beforehand, and have native speakers already either online if that technology is available for investigation and for further interviews, or to have them on the ground where needed, and most likely it would be needed. So in terms of hiring African workers, I didn't quite understand. Maybe you can reiterate what was the question there again.
Okay, it was a question about what can we do to prevent the recruitment of workers from Africa, specifically to the Middle East, with offers of jobs and then they
that don't
slavery.
exist.
Yeah.
Well, actually, this is a problem that touches on much larger segments of the population, not just African workers. I think when we look at international recruitment, this is a very, very common problem for many different populations. Fraud is omnipresent. We can say that there are many job offers that just don't pan out, and they're simply not there, and it's a fraudulent operation. Of course, to combat something like that, there are platforms available in certain parts of the world. For example, there's a platform called Contratados, based in the United States and Mexico, that helps migrant workers from Mexico to find already approved recruiters that have been already ranked by the migrant workers themselves. There is a tool like that. So basically, workers helping workers. It's a word of mouth. And what is really essential sometimes in the international recruitment, that most of these processes are a word of mouth references. It's somebody who told somebody that this might work. So providing a greater capacity and access to platforms of that kind really empowers workers, enables them to access better information that has been proved where the recruiters have been rated. And of course, for companies, I would say the responsibility really is on everybody to provide for better channels. It's the government responsibility to make sure that the players that are operating are licensed, again, that they're legal entities, that there is a greater level of transparency, that we know who these people even are. Second of all, companies that are working with these parties also need to understand that these parties are responsible and that they're legal, and this is a really kind of a clean channel. So it really touches all of us. Same with investors, same with the international community and the civil society, to make sure that we shine the light on this problem, and that people who are criminals need to be in jail. Finally, a remediation component is really important here, because these are kind of emerging new crimes for which legislation has not been fully established. I think Helen mentioned gang masters in UK. We can really say that the number of entities or parties, violators that are in jail for these kind of crimes is still very minimal. That it's still, we don't have a lot of judicial action taken in punishing these kind of individuals. So working from every perspective to really combat this issue is critical. Again, greater education and training for the migrants. I think in many countries, whenever we conduct a recruitment process, pre-departure orientation is really critical, where workers, first of all, understand the terms and conditions of the job, where it's explained to them in their native language, where they signed it off, and when there is any kind of an assurance mechanism and grievance mechanism, if there is something unclear or not well, they have an opportunity to raise that issue. So there are processes in place, and unfortunately they're not implemented everywhere, but we're slowly moving towards that greater transparency in recruiting as the problems become more apparent.
Okay, thank you very much, Valentina. Chris, do you have anything to add with regard to the technology element?
I think the first one is, there are lots of simple tools like Google Earth out there that can be used to check whether sites that we're told are source sites and factories really are there, and certainly that helps from a supply chain transparency perspective. But I think probably one of the most interesting ones at the moment is the Traffic Analysis Hub. And you can Google that, but they are bringing together data from corporates, NGOs, law enforcement right across the world to highlight where there are instances of trafficking. So that data can be used to almost spot risk, and then to whether it's in a sourcing country or in our case in the UK where there are instances of trafficking. And that's pulling data together through, I think they're using an IBM Watson algorithm to pull it together, to share that level of knowledge, because it is criminality, and we need to use as much of that technology as possible. And certainly I'm overlaying that against my Google Earth maps of all of the sourcing and all of the quarries and all of the areas that I've got, to see where my risks potentially are growing and moving forward.
The question about immigration slavery is really important, and it's good to see, I mean, not just in Australia, but, emerging through the Bali process across Asia Pacific, that the Dhaka principles, those 10 principles are getting repeated reference, and, they have those 10 principles and the core principles, but the implementation guidance for those is also really practical. And so when you start looking at responsible recruitment, I think you need to start encouraging businesses towards those responsible recruitment frameworks much more. The second point about technology, just a really quick mention, there was a really good IFC paper, International Finance Corporation paper, came out, it was a good practice note, came out a couple of months ago. I had to look up the name. It was just called Managing Risks Associated with Modern Slavery, but it goes into quite a bit of detail about the use of technology, really, really useful. And the third thing, Valentina, answered the question about culture really well. We had a webinar a couple of weeks ago on World Day Against Trafficking in Persons, and we had the CEO of Outland Denim talking about establishing responsible supply chains. But he said the most important thing you can do is understand the cultures of the location of the workers. So understand the cultures where the workers are. And it's really important to remember that most grievance mechanisms are designed by middle-aged white guys, like myself. I'm not looking around the webinar at all, but are designed by middle-aged white guys. And so the assumption that workers will be able to access these is just overlooking so many different factors. So the cultural point is really, really important.
So that's really useful. Thank you. Okay, so we're getting inundated by questions. If you're a smaller organization, it's difficult to track back through your supply chain. You can ask questions, produce questionnaires, gather information, collect policies and the like, but physically checking is not practicable. Is there a methodology for smaller organizations to overcome this?
One of the foundational things that we're seeing here in Australia is the very first step about asking where things come from. So asking about labor practices and asking about materials. And it's not that you're asking for certification. It's not that you're asking, but you're asking about knowledge. You're asking these questions. And once you can start asking, there are, companies with huge supply chains or tiny ones, then you can start to measure that continuous improvement. But if you don't start asking the question, you can't track that change over time, and you can't start saying, these are the changes we want to see.
Brilliant. Thank you, Robin. Helen, anything to add on the subject of small companies?
Yeah, one of the things we haven't mentioned in this so far is about the risk proportion. And actually for small organizations, the risk profile is a bit of a different one. So in our legislation in the UK, and I think it's the same in Australia, there is actually a bit of intelligent insight into the guidelines, which is you address where the risk is the highest. You start to affect that. So what that means is that from a small organisation, your immediate risk is probably going to be your own people or your labour agencies, the ones that you have direct control over. If you're then getting into the materials side, you've got to be able to assess where that risk is. But as in any good standard, and the ISO standard 2400 does this, the new modern slavery one will do exactly the same thing. I'm trying to make sure it does. It has that risk assessment that's attached to leverage and ability to influence. And an SME, when you're undertaking your risk assessment, you are not going to have the ability to influence down the supply chain, do lots of audits, do lots of verifications. However, Robin's point is correct. You can ask questions of your supply chain on what they are doing. And actually, you'll be surprised. Maybe some of the ones that you've got are already doing a lot of things. So it's a quick win for you. If there are some people that are doing things and some people are not, it's then up to you as a small organisation to make the moral and ethical choice over, are you prepared to go with somebody who is managing your risk on your behalf? So it isn't about, I don't think at any point is it about an SME suddenly going off and doing lots of audits, because you can't afford to do that with the margins, particularly for, I should imagine you're on, in construction. But you are encouraged in more of that collaborative piece and more of that question asking piece. But focus on your risk first. Where is the biggest risk for you? Where can you make the biggest difference? Then start to move on. Hopefully that answers it.
You know, going back to one of my very first points about collective action, but was to look at who else can be taking action in that space and to work with them. Because yes, as a small business, you may have very little leverage, but the more you can work with similar organizations or, you know, across a sector, you have increasing leverage and they are getting the message again and again.
Thanks, Robin. Chris or Valentina, do you have anything to add on the subject of small business?
Yeah, I'd just echo what Helen said and just to, think about the categorization of risk and products and purchases. So you've got, now if it's labour, that's clearly direct and indirect labour. That's one that you are absolutely responsible for. And thinking about whether it's either 100 million Aussie dollars or 36 million UK pounds. The Modern Slavery Act in the UK still makes it clear that it is illegal to knowingly or unwittingly use modern slavery. So it's everyone's responsibility. But so direct labour. Then you've got things like consumables, and we're all using laptops, iPads. It's not for us to make sure that we understand that full transparency in that supply chain, because I can't particularly change it. We've, from our perspective, Marshals, we're clearly prioritising raw materials and goods for resale. So where we actually are saying that this is a product that we feel happy in selling. So it's that categorization of the products, and then look at the risk profiles. And there's lots of information out there. So get the Global Slavery Index out and look at a sourcing country. Start to use some of the other online resources. We've got something called that I developed called an Ethical Risk Index that looks at every country and the level of risk by the driver of risk, and then what we're doing to mitigate it. But all of that information to drive that country and cluster and sector risk is publicly available information. So start to pull some of that in. But it's unreasonable to expect a small business to be responsible for things they can't influence. But if it's raw material, I would suggest if it's raw materials or goods for resale, then it is absolutely essential that you do that.
I'll just add a little bit, maybe a little bit too optimistic here, but I've noticed that for smaller businesses, actually, some of the practices and keeping with the reputational pressure was slightly easier because for some firms, it would be easier to actually conduct a vertical integration of the production where they really have a greater control on their entire supply chain. It might be smaller. They might know the suppliers much better face to face. And just in this time and age, coming to market is very, very challenging. You need to establish a reputation beforehand because that is the expectation. Everybody expects you to do well, to be green, to be clean. And I think many new companies have been born and established with that notion and that philosophy already in mind, that sustainability is really at the forefront, at the core of their corporate culture. So I've noticed that for smaller businesses, the process was a little bit more, basically paved with good intentions from the beginning, and it was easier to establish good rapport, good relationship, and good traceability of those smaller supply chains than rather than change the entire process that was, let's say, established in the 70s overseas. And it's so opaque, it's so difficult to penetrate, it's so difficult to really understand where the levers are and who is responsible for what, where the system would be very cumbersome to change. So I would say that for me, with smaller companies, there's inherently less risk from the reputational standpoint because of these points.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So I need to disclose now that Helen and I had a conversation with Carl Thomas from SIPS yesterday, and Helen threatened him with all sorts of terrible things if he asked difficult questions. But he has anyway, so thank you, Carl. Two questions from Carl that I'm going to put to the panel. The first one, in the panel's opinion, to what extent has the COVID-19 pandemic pushed the issue of modern slavery and ethical appointment off the agenda with organisations? Carl has also made a point about Robin's comment about, you can categorise people into four groups, which is the final one was the rest. And are there subcategories there of the rest who know and the ignorant rest, those who just don't know? So maybe if I can start with randomly Robin, as one of those things was your issue. So could you subdivide the rest down, and also what's your opinion in terms of the impact of COVID?
Far out. I wish I had $1 for every business that I'd heard say, "Oh, we can't be worrying about human rights right now. There's a pandemic on."
Or customer service, or anything, actually. Yeah.
There's
a universal excuse for not doing things.
I'm fine without good customer service, but human rights is fairly foundational.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, absolutely.
And I would have thought this would be the one time that organizations would most need to work with their suppliers, not just to guarantee supply, but to make sure that people were safe and getting paid a living wage and all of these things. So yes, it's been a massive issue here in Australia. There have been numerous examples of, fashion and clothing chains just deciding that, they wanted to wait an extra 6 months to pay their suppliers, or actually they wanted to pay their suppliers 50% of the invoice value, or it was fine for workers to be sleeping under desks as long as they answered the phones. And things have just got trampled on. So there is very much an urgency to be working more closely with suppliers now more than ever. On the second part, yes, I think the rest can be split into those that know and those that don't know. Those that know may just be the ones with a toe on the ladder, but at least they're aware of the issue. As an interesting aside, the Property Council of Australia's supplier platform, there's a whole stream of questions in there which suppliers need to answer, and the big property and construction firms have been highlighting their red flag questions. And of course, we hire labour overseas, or there are recruitment fees paid is a red flag question, or we source materials or products overseas. But I was interested that for most of them, one of the big red flag questions was, we haven't undertaken any training or any engagement around modern slavery yet. And I was really heartened by that, because it means that they're looking for a basic level of awareness about what's going on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Robin. Chris, do you have a view on either or both of those questions?
I think if you go for COVID, I think COVID has amplified. So I think, it's definitely shown that the good businesses are really coming through as really good businesses. And the things that they've done in the past are really helping them in good stead. Yep. And that the bad businesses are potentially getting worse and are showing their true colours. So I think to an extent, it should be a little easier from a procurement perspective to spot the good and the bad. I think The real thing on COVID we just haven't seen yet, and there are lots of responses coming around the world in terms of unemployment and kind of financial impact. I don't think we've seen that, but I do think it's amplified business behaviour. Robin said it there, but we had a major fashion retailer in the UK who just simply decided that they weren't going to pay for any orders that they had. And lo and behold, that fashion retailer probably won't get supplied again. So good businesses versus bad businesses, it's pretty clear.
Thank you, Chris. Valentina, anything to add?
COVID crisis. I would say that it only really amplifies the need for more efforts because it exacerbates vulnerability of the populations that were already vulnerable in the beginning, in the first place. Layoffs, job cuts, unemployment globally, inability to really continue the business affects migrants and the workers that I mentioned, the most vulnerable workers the most. So I would say that would call for more of an effort to assure compliance, to make sure that those violations are not in place and to remediate. So I would say that it's a challenge that actually to me doesn't take away attention from that issue. It puts more attention to that issue of modern slavery.
Okay, thank you. Finally, Helen, anything to add to what the other speakers have said?
I suppose one way to look at it is the finance community and the growing increase of ESGs and the environmental social governance. There is more and more pressure on businesses now to be reporting what they're doing in this space. And it is actually coming into the financial decision-making processes, finally, for financial institutions. Still probably not as much as it needs to be, but it's there. And it is making decisions on behalf of whether you are going to be invested in, whether you're going to get insurance, whether the businesses are going to be supported or not. And in fact, I saw at the beginning of the COVID crisis, a very, very interesting webinar that talked about the shareholder performance of organisations who had invested in ESGs over those that hadn't. And it was dramatic. I mean, everyone was under the curve because obviously we're all losing money at the moment. But those in that space, the ESGs, were literally just tripping underneath the line. Those that hadn't were hitting rock bottom. So I think it is trying to get it into businesses' psyches that there is almost like a race going on here, and it isn't about price anymore. The race is about which business is going to be more resilient at the end of all of this. And we now have business cases that prove resilient businesses look after their supply chains, look after their employees, and they are the ones that are going to come out at the end of this crisis a lot better than those that are thinking that the short-term approach is the best one. Shaun, there's one question in the comments from Antonio, the conversation between Helen and Antonio around PQQs.
Yes, that was the next one I was going to ask. Would you like to pick that up, Helen? Yeah, please do.
I did notice, and for those of you who don't know me know that procurement is my sort of first love. One of the conversations that's going on between Antonio and Helen in the chat box is about the use of pre-qualifications and why does this thing happen? Because you put a pre-qualification question in, don't you? And it selects the right suppliers. And Carl might, on the call, might roll his eyes from SIPS on this one. It is as good as your procurement process. If it's a bad procurement process, you're going to get bad results. Pre-qualification still has this opportunity to ask about whether you have policies. And anyone who knows me knows my opinion on dusty document syndrome and the fact that policies are usually some sort of adverts to the world that they may or may not do and are not held accountable. So pre-qualification needs to focus on evidence, on experience, on what you are doing. And the best question I've seen in pre-qualification is give me your top 5 modern slavery risks and what you're doing about them. That shows that organisations are thinking about these things. The second thing is the bit that I think we're very bad in procurement at, which is the whole bit around supplier management and relationship management with our supply chain, and particularly forms of contract. Procurement are very good at passing risk via contracts down a supply chain and saying it's your fault, you deal with it, you get on with it. Times are changing, I think, in procurement now that we have to think about the forms of contract and the measures that influence behaviours. And also then how we measure those suppliers. So go back to the point about risk. You need to get closer and more involved with the suppliers who import your risk and manage them better rather than just a PQQ or sorry, Valentina, an audit. That is one of an arsenal of things you need. It has to be a whole combination of. So the conversation's going on between Antonio and Helen on there is it has an art, but it's only as good as how you use it.
Yeah,
I'm passionate on
can I just add to that? One of the big issues that we've got in construction in particular is the change of specification. So it can be in the original contract that a certain product from a certain country was specified, but the latest research from people like the Construction Products Association, BRE, is showing that almost half of those specifications can be changed, and there will be potentially very little visibility at the top of the chain about what has happened. So it could start with really good intentions, but actually from a cost perspective, and we're certainly under the cost from a cost perspective at the moment, it gets de-specced or changed throughout that supply chain. So it's not just about the first qualification tender process.
It's exactly
through the supply chain to once that building is actually built, and has it been built with the materials that were originally specified.
And it goes into the specification at the very beginning design phase. It doesn't matter whether you're building a building, designing PPE, or designing the latest slinky dress. Fundamentally, it's about, I'm going to do that with an ethical bent associated with it. But I want not just a dress, but I want the dress with the best ethical solution associated with it. You get that embedded very, very, very close at the beginning. And actually, there's very little wiggle room as you go through the supply chain. If you don't even mention it at that outset, like you say, it tends to fall away and add cost because you're not thinking about it earlier on.
And we've now come to the end of the hour and a half, and have probably still got several more hours worth of stuff to talk about. So, firstly, thank you, a sincere thank you to all of the four speakers. You've been excellent, and we could have really covered more and more, and thank you to the audience for your great questions as well. Thank you very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.